All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to meeting number 82 of the Ethereum Core Developer Call. I'm Hudson. I will be your host and organizer today. And today's going to be a little different because we're not talking about a ton of subjects. It's generally going to be two subjects, and if we have time, James Hancock has proposed a few other ones, including stuff with a difficulty bomb, if I'm not mistaken. Um, so the current plan is for this to be a 2-hour call. The first hour is going to be dedicated to the BLS curve signature stuff. That's we need to get ready for ETH 2.0. And the second hour, if it takes an hour, is going to be on collecting technical updates on ProgPow, community dissent on ProgPow, and next steps for ProgPow. So the purpose of the ProgPow discussion isn't as much to necessarily declare it's alive or it's dead. That's going to be up to the core developers per the EIP process, obviously. And we don't really have a good process for going back on something if it's accepted because that hasn't happened very often, but we'll be getting to that later. That's generally something I guess the core developers are going to have to decide and others after some discussion on process. But the main reasons are because there's been ProgPow technical updates as far as some updates based on the least authority and Bob Rao audits that are reflected in new versions of ProgPow. There's been some, I guess the word would be exploits that have been found in ProgPow since then that are being addressed and need to be understood. We also want to talk about the community dissent of ProgPow. That's going to have two people from the pro side and two people from the anti side. And then Ben D. Francisco talking about his compromise idea. If you go to the agenda, you can see who's representing both sides. And then finally, next steps for ProgPow. If we get to a point where we can move on and figure out the next steps from a technical or community perspective, that's another thing we're going to be doing. So that's a summary of how the ProgPow discussion is going to go. I know everyone's here for the BLS curve discussion, though, so we can go ahead and start that one. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'm going to pass this over to the hard fork coordinator, James Hancock, to run the BLS curve discussion for now, and he can tap me in if needed. Take it away, James.
Thank you, Hudson. So for some context on this, the EIP centric model, we focus around when an EIP is ready, then to ship it, and to decide the schedule at that point. And coming up is the phase 0 and the deposit contract for phase 0 of ETH2, and that uses BLS. And so that gave us some kind of orientation to try to get something to work for them, as well as address some of the concerns in EIP 1962 of having a very large attack surface that came up in the last few calls. So there's been a lot of work since on a working group around precompiles for elliptic curve cryptography. And do you want to kind of go over that, Alex? Alex? Update.
Yeah, well, depending who would want to start, who's another Alex who would lead it? No?
Yeah, whoever from your.
Okay, well, I mean, I can start in principle. Right now, well, first of all, there were 3 pull requests into the EIP repository. One for BLS 12 381 curve, which is what Ethereum 2.0 guys want. Another one was for what's called the Zexi curve, another one of the flavor BLS 12. And the third one was for a curve which allows efficient aggregation of the proofs on the Zexi curve. So kind of like one layer of recursion. Those are very similar, but after some recent thoughts and some comments from Vitalik into one of the GRs, I think I will change the specs. They will be even simpler. And binary interface will be 32-byte aligned, like everything which exists right now. Even while we don't need this alignment It's just easier for developers to follow. The second part that will change, there will be an extension, because for BLS signatures, one needs to have a functionality of being able to hash into the curve point, which wasn't in the original proposal and was never part of the EIP 1962. But it's not that difficult to add this one. So in principle, it will require like 1 more week of work, and then it should be kind of final in terms of the spec, and there will exist at least one implementation in Rust.
Did you say that? Mark,
Yeah, I was just wondering because the agenda doesn't contain the links, but which EAP number is the one that is required for 2.0 interop?
I think it was something like 2537.
I put them in the chat.
So the original draft of this PR was largely based on kind of legacy of EIP 1962, following the same logic. But since this will be curve specific, we can it's no longer possible to it will be difficult to make subgroup checks optional. But instead we can use much more aggressive optimizations to offset the cost of the subgroup check. So I will update this PR and other corresponding PRs with this information and the binary interface, of course. But in principle, there is a very small difference between those, as they just, for now, list 3 different curves. And the difficulty of implementing them is already negligible, because they all exist either in separate implementations, like in Zexy as a part of 1962 and some standalone libraries. So in principle, it would be good to just accept. Would be good to just accept all 3 of them together.
From the ETH2 side, Alex Stokes, do you have any on how this fits in to Martin's question?
Sorry, I guess I missed Martin's question. Or was this just like general, why do we want this?
The one for, you can say it again.
Well, no, my question was only exactly which EAP number it was that was directly related to ETH2.0, and the answer was
right.
2537. So I guess my follow-up question would be, so 2537, does that fully cover all the needs for 2.0? And does it add anything unnecessary, or is there an unnecessary complexity which is not actually needed? I mean, could there be a simple one that?
Sure. Yeah. So.
Okay, Alex, please answer. I can extend it after.
Oh, I was just going to say for ETH2, so if anything, we'll need to add another precompile as part of this like hash to curve functionality, but that's for like some more sophisticated applications, like if we were to do a light client as a smart contract. A lot of the stuff we're pushing for so far is just to have this one precompile, what was it, 2537, which would enhance the security of the deposit contract.
And that was part of the one.
Or I should say usability, like the deposit contract is secure.
I had a quick question. Was there a meeting in Paris in the last 48 hours about this? I'm just curious, if there was a meeting and what the goal of that meeting was.
As far as I know, at least from the developers chat, because I wasn't in Paris personally, it was canceled due to the coronavirus. Like people were leaving Paris earlier, so it was canceled.
Yeah, that's right. It didn't happen.
Alex, so you have the 3 PRs and it'll take a week to put in the hash to, I don't remember how to say it.
Yeah, it's called just hash to curve. And yeah, it will just take a week to implement the current, like there is an IETF draft, how to do this. And I will just take the draft and implement it. And it's what people would want.
So I would make a suggestion here that, I mean, the BLS 381 curve or whatever it's called is obviously there's a particular need for that and the use case. I don't personally see any reason to roll out 3 EAPs and 3 new precompiles and 3 new curves in one go. And I know that Alex Vlasov wants it, or Meta Labs, but I would like to hear the opinion of, for example, Vitalik and Alex Stokes, who are, perhaps have a bit longer history in Ethereum and cryptography.
So the curves that are being proposed, other than BLS 12381, one is a BLS 12377, and the other is the curve that goes inside of BLS 12377. So the reason why people are interested in these curves is basically because they want to do recursive snarks so that you can do a snark over one field that kind of efficiently proves over snarks that are in the other field. Um, there and this is valuable for a bunch of applications. So, like for example, if you want to use zero knowledge proofs for both privacy and scalability, then in most setups you're going to need one layer of recursive snarking because the users provide the first level snark, and then whoever's doing the kind of witness aggregation does a snark of all of of all of the participant snarks, and that's how you get your scalability back. Um, the question, I guess, is adding these 2 extra curves kind of necessary for achieving this objective. So like one way in which it would not be necessary, for example, is if we invent, say, efficient range checks, which would allow us to efficiently do arithmetic over one field inside of another field, or potentially some other kind of totally different construction where, for example, something either you do bulletproofs on the inside, or even something else entirely. So with kind of current technology, like indefinite, adding support for things like BLS 12377 in particular is going to make the and building those kinds of 2-layer Snark applications easier. But and I personally am aware of kind of some research developments on the horizon that could also allow for recursive Snarks without but using these special curves. So if we would do not include these special curves, then it wouldn't be like, I don't think it would be kind of long term fatal to Ethereum's utility as a way for making as a way for building recursive Stark applications, but it could delay things for some amount of time. So it's a trade off between, I guess, making things easier for developers versus the added complexity of supporting these 3 curves instead of one.
I should add to Vitalik's words that there already exists constructions which allow both privacy and scalability in this form, just more tinkering with the same things like snarks over BLS 12377, as then you just make a Stark-like proof over the base field of BLS 12377 because it has enough roots of unity. But it's just a formal addition. So in principle, you could do this already, but an amount of work which would be required for people to actually make it work is enormous compared to to what people can already start to use with what Zexi has made. And in addition, just difference between two BLS 12 curves is completely negligible, as was demonstrated by 1962. And what's usually called the outer curve for this construction was also made in more than one copy in different code bases. So I don't think it will be necessary to support them because those precompiles are curve specific, and as soon as they are final and follow the specs and as a part of the IP 1962 work, there was already a lot of work done to identify the vulnerabilities. It will not be a work to support them. It will even not be a work to make the initial implementations because they already exist. More or less, you should take them and integrate it to the code, then support them after.
We also have Kobe on the call who joined, who's been working with the cryptography side. I wonder if you have some thoughts on this as well for answering.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can also in. So just also to give some color, one very interesting construction that uses this pair of curves, 377 and this SW6, the other curve, is actually the Zexi construction itself, which already allows doing some sort of private smart contracts in Starks, which is something that is very interesting for various applications, and even specifically the applications that Zexi mentioned in their paper. And I want to sympathize with what Alex said, that the amount of work that would be needed to use the current constructions for either private smart contracts or scalability is very small if you use this pair of curves, and all the other constructions are currently a work in progress. So either use Starks or Fractal or things like that. These are things that are not available for developers today, and it's not very clear when they would be available and how efficient they would be for practical use cases. So I would be happy to have this kind of thing included, but I would also sympathize with what Vitalik said, that it wouldn't be fatal to long-term Ethereum support of recursive snarks, but it would be really nice for developers to have this capability right now.
And to just clarify a bit, that last part you talked about, was that concerning the two EAPs that have nothing to do with ETH2?
That is not related to ETH2, yes. For the one for ETH2, I just supported many pluses.
Right. I have two questions. So one being that I would like to hear what Luis Guzman has to say. And the other one would be, I'll just say both things right away. If someone has, I mean, I recall when we added Blake, and 6 months into the process, Axic actually tested the ABI and noticed that it was kind of cumbersome to deal with, and that you have to shuffle things around if you want to do it repeatedly and things like that. So I'm just wondering if anyone has done a sanity check that this format is kind of sane and fits the use cases that someone might have on it.
Well, in principle, as a part of 1962, which has much more complex ABI, I have implemented a Solidity contract to do the calls. But with this one, I mean, for this set of 3 precompiles, because API will be updated to be 32-byte aligned, it should be much simpler.
Can I just react on top of all the comments so far? So Martin, you asked me to my opinion so far. So my concern was specific to 1962 as I believe that the scope of the EIP was too broad and would be very hard to test, and also back then I felt that the scrutiny that this EIP has been going through from the rest of the community, meaning people like Kobe or Zach or the people from the cryptography teams, was a bit lacking. Regarding specific curve, I don't have any concern. I mean, from like the raw cryptography, and I'm not talking from the implementation perspective. I mean, specific curve, from my perspective, shouldn't be too much of an issue. And I just want to comment on one thing about what Kobe said about Fractal and Starks being not available to public today. That's genuinely true. I mean, some people, and Alex can knows about it because he's working on the Stark equivalent, I guess, with Redshift. But I'm not opposing any sort of technology to come in because something else exists somewhere. So my point would be, as of, if we know which curve we're having, if we know we have a lot of scrutiny, I would feel a lot more comfortable with the IPs.
So yeah, from my perspective, as I see it, we have obviously something similar. Well, something that feels like a deadline for the BLS 12381. As far as I can understand, the other two doesn't. So I would propose that all are EFI, but we prioritize BLS 12381, and then we'll see if the other ones make it into the same art fork or perhaps a later one. And I would probably aim for a later one for the other ones, but who knows, it might be trivial to add two more once we do the first one.
Is there any formal definition of the deadline for this? Because from my perspective, there is no difference in time when both, for example, 12.381 and 12.377 will be finished, because they are just not different.
Yeah, James, do you know about that, or anyone else more into the 2.0 rollout schedule?
So I have just another question on the 381. So if we want to make an ETH2 Lite client, the thing that you mentioned that's not in there yet has to do with points to hashing, and I'm gonna guess that's like the SWU map or whatever it is in the point to hash construction.
Well, for now, I was aiming for SDVW construction, which is universal for all these trust curves.
Right.
But I mean, the part that will not be a part of the precompile is like the first step in IETF draft, which is hashing into the filled element. But this can be done by the smart contract. So I don't want to touch this ground, because maybe people will want to change the hash function later, and I don't want to hard code it. But the expensive part, which is kind of mapping the filled element into the curve point, which is expensive and non-trivial, it will be as a part of the precompile.
Some thoughts on the schedule. Does Alex, the hash to curve, is that going to be going in with as part of the EIP with the BLS precompile?
Yeah, I mean, I need to update the PR for this part.
Yeah,
but it's more or less clear what to do, and it's not that difficult.
Or Alex, for also the 3 EIPs you all proposed, the pairing you're giving, is it a pairing check or is it a pairing? Do we get the GT element in it?
No, for the same reason of kind of like backwards compatibility with what's currently available for BN254. It's just a check. You don't get an answer in the form of GT element. And I know there was kind of a request for this, but then it will inflate the set of precompiles to actually later use this GT element. So it's not part of the current precompile.
Okay, I mean it's yeah, okay. I mean it's too bad as like it would be nice to have it, but I understand your take on it.
In my opinion, we can add another EIP to do that if we want to introduce that.
Going back to Martin's thoughts on scheduling, that the BLS precompile has a pressing need to get in, and having that be the focus for what will go in around Berlin makes sense. For the other ones, although I know that they take a similar amount of work to get ready, it would be nice to have sort of to battle test this scenario with just the one precompile, and then if there was a group that showed up that had a pressing need that says we're working on this thing and this is why, and we have this, and we've looked at the ABI and sanity checked it and those things as well on the other precompiles, that would be kind of more supporting that it should go into the first fork. But otherwise, I like the idea of having Berlin include just the one BLS, and then having the upcoming forks include the other precompiles.
No, my question was more like what is the deadline for Berlin fork itself? So it's like by what times the BLS 12381 should be finished by itself?
There isn't it is when it's ready, when the EIP is ready to go, and we hope that lines up with the schedule for ETH2. So maybe Alex, the other Alex, as part of ETH2 schedule, how does that fit in?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think all of this is just kind of when it's ready. The thing that we would do here is, again, just to enhance the usability of the deposit contract. It would basically let us make another smart contract that says, hey, is this deposit valid, before someone sends ETH to the actual deposit contract. But either way, like the intention is already to have other places in the stack that do these checks, right? So it's not that it's like the end of the world if the timelines don't align. And also too, I don't know if anyone wants to commit to a beacon chain launch timeline right now.
Alex, I have a question for you. I heard that BLS, the ETH2 curve, the BLS we're talking about right now, is part of the IETF like process right now, maybe being standardized. Are we planning to use inside the precompile a known and somewhat battle tested library, or is it something that is going to be built custom for the fork?
Well, in principle, for now, my reference implementations will be based on current work for 1962, in the sense that it's all already built. We just need to change the ABI and make it curve specific. Alternatively, developers could use Zcash library for BLS 12381 or current or other ETH 2.0 libraries. It's just say maybe not all of them already have hash to curve function. Everything else they already have. Plus minus, you will need to make an ABI. There will be no difference between them in terms of the results if they're all valid. The only thing can be is a difference in performance, because I can only guarantee something for the code which we made for 1962. So that this is, I mean, where the performance is good and it aligned between the implementations. For everything outside, which will be up to the particular node developers to use as in their code base, I just cannot give this guarantee. But I can give the guarantee that there exists an implementation which is fast enough.
Thanks.
Vitalik, did you have a question in chat, or did that get answered?
I think Alex just answered it in chat. That's reasonable. No, just the reason why I'm asking is that like, if the goal of the 381 is to make it possible to make an ETH2 client inside of ETH1, then that hash to curve thing is going to be necessary. That was it.
How fast do you expect the hash to curve to find a point to find a hash?
Well, the current, if I remember the code from IETF draft, it's not based on a sample and reject. So it should be just the same price every time. I cannot give you an exact number because I didn't benchmark it.
Okay, because it would be, I mean, I don't know what would be the consequences of something that just would blow up, either a risk or is it impossible, basically?
Well, I mean, an example for this when you can actually make a precompile, but it's useless, is actually the optional part of the current PLS 12381 precompile, which is point decompression, which kind of was on the table initially, but then by just looking at the numbers which you get from from the call to such precompile, it's much simpler to just send decompressed points as a part of your data than try to do the decompression, especially for G2 points. So that's why it's also most likely going to be removed. But for hashing to curve, it's more like like there is no option. We either use it just to get the functionality, and even if it will be expensive, which I don't expect, there is no other option, or just people will not use this functionality if they have some other way to get around this.
Okay, and the last point I will have, I saw Alexei talked a lot about white box fuzzing. Could you elaborate on this? What kind of guarantee should it bring, and like what timeline can we expect it? And also, does it concern the three EIP you're pushing right now, or is it concerning only 1962 as defined previously?
Well, more or less what the point Alexei wanted to discuss is like whether you curve arithmetic is valid. In a sense, if you take two equal points, you add them up together, and then you try to take this point and double, do the results coincide? I mean, so such basic checks are usually part of the work when you implement the precompile. When you just implement curve operations, and if any of those fails, then you will never end up in actually implementing the pairing operation, which is like the most difficult one. But for now, in the code base, which is in part of the 1962, there are checks that what could be called white box. They just check basic arithmetic properties by definition that if you take point and it's and negated point, you get the point of infinity as a result of addition. And same for bilinearity for pairing check. So if it can ever be called the white box fuzzing, then it's yes. But for me, it's more like if your arithmetic works or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you just don't have a valid implementation. You will never end up in actually getting the right result for pairing.
Thank you. This is really helpful to get through. I wanted to have go through some administrative parts of this, just kind of in order. So 2537, 2539, and 2541. Martin talked about being comfortable moving those into EFI. I wanted to hear from the other clients if that is also their position. I don't believe Dano's here, but it's Tim. Could you speak on that from Besu?
Yeah, I think for Besu, I would agree that moving all three to EFI makes sense and having a focus on the first one. And given that, like you said, Dano's not here, I think for us committing to just that one and looking at the implementation and the client before kind of committing to all three for a specific date is probably better.
Okay. Nethermind?
I think Thomas is going to be late. Oh no, he's here.
I'm on the call, but somehow I missed the question. Is it about a the EIP that we are discussing, or the things? Please repeat the question.
It's the three EIPs for the elliptic curves that we've been discussing. We want to move them to EFI, but I wanted to have all clients to have a chance.
Yeah, so because we were working on ETH2, it means that we already have the library for BLS connected. So I was listening with the idea that whatever happens, we should be ready without any problems, because we already have all the bindings, hash the curve, the BLS curves, and all of them are supported in Harumi, I think.
So then no opposition to moving those three EIPs to eligible for inclusion?
I don't want to make any statement here whether it's a right decision or not. So I think that it's up to others rather to know exactly whether this is ready. I think that the only risks are if there are some changes to how exactly they'll be used in Ethereum 2, and if our APIs will be actually offering the perfect response to that needs. So if that is fine, then yeah, no opposition from us.
Okay. And then from Open Ethereum, is there a representative here to weigh in on these?
I think Artem's here. Are you on mute, Artem? There you go.
Yep. But I am not going to comment on this one, so no objection from me.
So no, Martin, you're still okay with this? From Geth team?
Yes, but I suspect that, I mean, it's good that we say we make the BLS 12381 the priority, because I believe that there is still quite a lot of work to do on the actual EAPs and the specifications, and then there are the implementations. So yeah, I think we'll focus on that one. And I mean, being in the EFI means that once all the steps are done, we may schedule it. So this is not like binding ourselves to getting all three through. Just want to note that. And yeah, check with Peter that I'm not approving on behalf of the Geth team without your approval.
No, I feel free to do it.
I wanted to have the motion of moving those to EFI first. And I also agree with the focusing on the BLS precompile in particular, and having that be what is getting ready. And asks that would help for scheduling the other ones would be having a team that's implementing or shows a need for it that would provide a timeline in the same urgency that the BLS one has. But I don't that's not something I know today. That's just a feedback to the proposers that would be helpful when it comes to scheduling it. So I'd say that gets accepted to, those are moved to EFI without, if there isn't any strong objections.
Can I just have one thing? I think those kind of adding of curve will happen more with the first one being BLS, but even the two might benefit from the process that's going to be defined for the first one. Could we treat this one as sort of a test ground for how we accept new crypto into the network? Which would mean that we probably require some crypto people coming in, defending the CIP, coming in and be willing to reply to integration issues during the calls, at like maybe attending like several calls just to make sure and then no question comes up during integration.
Yeah, that sounds great. And that's what I'm hoping to get out of this.
And yeah, I guess two more comments. One is like, the E2 BLS. I think while we were having this call, Ben and Alex, made some comments on Twitter that there's still some stuff that needs to be finalized. So like, just being mindful that there's going to be a lot of iterations on that. And then the second comment is just does that mean? I guess what does it mean for EIP 1962? Do we just move that out of EFI? I don't know. What do people think about that? Or we just leave it in EFI?
Did we ever put it into EFI?
I thought it was, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's still just a draft.
Well, as far as I remember, it was put into the EFI even back in something like
It's
August
in EFI.
last year.
It's on the list.
Yeah, it was kind of the requirements that it should be alternative implementations and a lot of fuzzy testing, which kind of was satisfied, but still was not enough. So we can either stay there, and if it's because for now, most of these new curves, at least work on these new curves, will be from my side, will be based on universal code base of 1962. So more or less, I think people will understand that it's not that difficult to actually satisfy also all the requirements of 1962, and eventually it can be included. Or maybe is 2.0 will come first, and then it will be awesome, and will be no problem to just have everything we want.
Martin, did you have a comment?
Well, I'm just a bit confused. I was kind of under the impression that if we roll out these kinds of precompiles one at a time, doesn't that kind of deprecate 1962?
Well, it kind of, if we stay at the today's state, then more or less a set of curves which people want, like which people can find an application. And even those three PRs for separate curves are actually not even close to the set of curves which people will want for even wider application. Because, for example, it does not include the full recursive snark cycle. If it ever be usable in the future, but why not? So, I mean, this would require to include more and more curves if some application will be found for them. Or, for example, if someone will want to have something like a precompile for Peterson hashing or something like this, which was kind of all covered in one 1962. So it's kind of the minimal viable set of the curves which people will want. And ideally, I would even include two more as a separate curves for step one, kind of.
I read there's less objection to over time adding more curves as people want them, especially as we fine tune the process of how to do that from an administrative and a technical perspective than it would be to do.
It was more or less a comment that it's much easier to support one precompile / implementation than kind of give developers a choice to include a lot of separate curves, which potentially much larger number of separate implementations, which can actually give them much more problems because the implementations will be much more different.
Problems from an implementation complexity or a security?
Well, more a security or maybe a performance. I mean, for BLS 12.381, there exists, let's say, 5 implementations, at least, if not more. And then in principle, they're all valid. They're all for the same curve, plus minus maybe performance differences, some internal stuff, more or less aggressive optimizations for some parts. And it gives just developers a lot of choice which implementation to include into the node. And then it can lead to the problems that even while in most of the cases this works, there still can be a case when it doesn't work between so many different implementations. Should not be a problem, I hope, but this may happen. While for 1962, it was more or less 3 complete implementations, which people could just pick one, and they're all consistent between each other, and then you never would have to kind of deviate from them, or if you want, you can just replicate the spec. But the spec was in the form that you just do these steps and never deviate from it, and then it's consistent. And it's especially was made this way.
So that if I'm understanding this right, the preference from Martin is that the possible usability difficulty isn't worth the possible security vulnerability for having such a large surface for things to go wrong. And that when weighing those two, the core devs would favor more precompiles over time as they're needed versus.
So I also think that this is something that might be very important here. So it's kind of good if there are alternative implementations made by like a different set of people for some of the precompiles. And I think this is something that with a design choice where basically we add individual precompiles for all kinds of functionality, it's easy to replace one precompile with a different implementation, but not the other one. Whereas with this like crypto VM, you have the VM and it works the way it works. And you can't actually like, I don't know, implement like specialized handling for something. So in the past, we've flown like pretty safe, having like many implementations of different EIPs, and it has uncovered bugs in like some implementation. So if for 1962, we would basically source all of the implementations, like, I think as far as I know, all the implementations for 1962 were made by the same group of people. So it's kind of
I mean, more or less, I explained it every previous call, but there were two implementations which were done by me, and there was a separate one done by a completely separate person. But more or less, my point was that by having a lot of independent precompiles, which potentially would allow a lot of independent implementations, it's potentially linear work in maintaining all of them or switching them or testing like cross testing between each other, which was already done as a part of 1962 for their current implementations. So it's more or less for developers to choose like whether one risk outweighs another or not. But it just the more choices which are possible, the larger amount of discrepancies between different implementations.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that we can basically always fall back on the 1962 implementation now. So if there is going to be like, future work to add like more sort of like cryptographic functionality, we can always just basically reuse the 1962 implementation to get it like very quickly. And then still, like if there is a need for us to, I don't know, implement it in a different way, or we just want to try out, like a different implementation, we can easily do it for just this one precompile. And this is more what I was saying, is that I feel like this is kind of a good thing.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I mean, it all started with a formal state of the 1962. So whether it's like pending delayed, infinitely staying ineligible for inclusion or whatever, it just you can place it in any form.
I would say it makes sense to have the BLS precompile supersede this one, but have the implementation tied to it, or like I'm not saying that correctly, but having this new set of EIPs supersede 1962 in some like an official capacity, so that there is a expectation around it.
Yes, it sounds like a right move.
Okay. So then we'll move those three EIPs into EFI. We'll note that we're focusing on the first one, BLS, as part of being Berlin, and that because of its usefulness for ETH2, and as a way to prove or test the process for doing these kind of precompile adds for cryptography. Then also that 1962, I hope I'm saying that number right, is superseded by these changes. And I think that's good, Hudson.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Just a moment. I need to see. Is Matt Luongo on the call?
Yeah. Well, before we go into the ProgPal stuff, the Dano isn't here. I just keeping everyone updated for what is being considered for Berlin, or what could be possible. So you have some time, Hudson, to warm up. The 2315 simple subroutines for the EVM. Do you have any quick updates, Greg, on that?
There's button. Pardon?
2315, the simple subroutines for the EVM. Is there any quick updates from that, like 60 seconds or less?
We're just moving along, implementing code, going over. I don't think there's been a whole lot of motion since the last meeting.
Okay. And Dano
has taken up more of my time.
Dano isn't here to talk about 2456, which is the time-based upgrades. And then I made a post about updating the difficulty bomb this morning, 2515, but we don't need to go on that today. That's just updates for the community. Okay, Hudson, there you go.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much for running that, James. Great discussion, everyone. So just to reiterate,
thank you all for joining for the BLS stuff. That is very helpful for all of you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. There was a lot of people here to support BLS, so and the discussion. So thank you all. So we're going to talk about ProgPow now. The reason this came up was there's been a lot of community discussion around it. And again, this call or this portion of the discussion is to go over three main things: technical updates on ProgPow, community approval / dissent of ProgPow, and next steps for ProgPow. So this is going to have some representatives from the pro ProgPow side and the anti ProgPow side. For the pro ProgPow side, we have Christy Lee Minehan and Michael Carter, aka Bitsby Trippin. On the anti-ProgPow side, we have Martin Kopelman. And then, Matt, are you here? Matt Luongo? Okay, maybe not able to make it, no problem. And then representing the compromise ideas, Ben DeFrancisco, which we'll go over. So to start things out, I wanted to just do really quick introductions of the 5 people I just named, or roughly 4 people I just named. So let's start with Christy, just a sentence or two about who you are, if you want to give a representation of, or you want to say that you represent anything in particular, that stuff.
Sure. So I am Miss If of If Def Elves, one of the proposers of EIP 1057, and my work is in both software and hardware. And I am currently representing If Def Elves today.
Great. I'll be referring to Michael as BBT. So BBT, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, guys, thanks for the time. Yeah, so my name's Mike Carter. I've hosted BBT, a channel that's been dedicated on mining since 2013, so one of the earlier ones in the space. And I'll be representing, which effectively is the community that is pro ProgPow on GPU mining.
Okay. Martin Kopelman. Sorry if I'm saying that last name incorrectly.
No, it's fine. I think I just one out of many voices, that have been against ProgPow. I can't really say that I represent this community because kind of there is no organization of that community. But other than that, I'm one of the co-founders of Gnosis and have been in the Ethereum space since almost the beginning. And recently with Gnosis, we are also starting to take over the development of Open Ethereum, but kind of that's kind of irrelevant here, maybe.
Okay, no, that's perfectly relevant in my opinion. And then B. Francisco.
Hey all, I'm Ben. I run a small software consultancy called Scopelift. We're focused on crypto. I'm a software engineer myself. I actually don't have any strong opinions on ProgPow, which is kind of why I put forth the compromise proposal that was posted on ETH Magicians. Just view it as a possible way forward for the community. There were a number of people who had proposed similar things. All I did was to kind of formalize it into a post with some specifics around it.
Okay, thank you. And even though I just introduced everyone who I invited to represent each side. That doesn't mean that everyone else in the call isn't allowed to speak or anything like that. You can definitely ask questions, have comments, things like that. Anybody else who is in the call. Oh, Matt, what's up?
Hey, sorry, it took me a minute there.
No problem. Just give a quick intro, like one or two sentences of who you are, which side you're representing, and if you have any like company representation or things like that.
Yeah, you got it. So hey guys, Matt Luongo. A little bit about me. I got involved with Bitcoin in 2013, 2014. I started working on Ethereum stuff in early 2017 on a project called Keep. I think what's interesting, we do a bunch of applied crypto. So while we're not doing core ETH protocol work, I do have a fair amount of knowledge. I have an engineering background, but I'm also a CEO, so I'm not as in it as I used to be. And I'm representing kind of the maybe let's not push ProgPow through side. I don't want to call it the anti-ProgPow side because I feel like I can be convinced, just not today. Yeah, good to see you guys.
Awesome, thanks, Matt. All right, so just to get started here, let's get technical updates on ProgPow. The things I want to particularly get covered are, since the two audits were released, I don't believe we've had a core developer call update from IfDefElse. Not that they were asked and didn't come or anything like that, but on some of the things reflected in the audit. And then additionally, there was an exploit that was released a couple days ago, I think, by someone in the community, and there was some confusion over that, as well as some conflation between that and the things outlined in the least authority and Bob Rao audit that the Ethereum cat herders um, got going. So I'm guessing Christy will probably cover this, but is there anyone else who volunteers along with Christy who would have the technical capacity to comment on this? It's all you, Christy. Sorry about that.
Sure, no problem. So in the least authority audit, which I guess we'll go through first, there were two suggestions. One was actually to increase the number of DAG items from 256 to 512. Dataset items generated. And that we will have a pull request hopefully by the end of today. Andrea Lanfranche has been working on that piece in particular. There was some work done by Powell on how that would affect light verification as well. And we have some paths to potentially optimize more on the light verification side. The other concern that least authority had was in relation to our Ketchak implementation, specifically the padding around our Ketchak. And let me just pull up the audit here. So for our Ketchak finalization, the value of in the Ketchak specification, it clearly states how you're allowed to use Ketchak. We don't add any extra padding. In no way that affects the cryptographic properties of Ketchak. So the padding in Ketchak actually just exists to make sure your different variants don't produce the same results. But we don't ever actually care about the result. So how we handle Ketchak is well within the scope of official Ketchak. We've reached out to the team that worked on Ketchak actually and proposed it, though we haven't heard back from them, just to give a look over it. And then the other suggestions on least authority were to create additional documentation, which is being worked on. And the other two, which is to establish a security framework for evaluating ASIC resistance, as well as monitoring hardware industry advances, is really is not within the scope of the proposed EIP, though I do agree that these would be very helpful suggestions to have. And shall I go through the recent proposed exploit by handle @kickx on Twitter?
Yeah, that'd be perfect. And also, if you can, my personal thing that I want to hear about is how that's different than the light evaluation attack that's referenced in, or not attack, I guess, but light valuation. What's it? there's a word for it, but basically that was in reference in Bob Rau's audit.
The light evaluation method.
Yep, that's it.
Yep. So for the, well, let me go through KickX's exploit first, which I think would be very helpful for the broader community. So about a day ago or 2 days ago, an anonymous user called KickX put up a proposed repo called ProgPow exploit. Specifically, this exploit said that if you have 64 bits in the seed function, you would be able to do a reverse guess on what your proposed nonce is going to be, and then you would be able to mangle the extra data field. You would be able to mangle the extra data field to be able to basically mangle the header and produce extra guesses. This is actually the Bitcoin, this is the exact same thing in Bitcoin where we have overt ASIC boost. It's important to understand that Kick's method is not related to the light evaluation. I'll go through that. So Kick's discovery relies on three basic assumptions. Number one, it requires you to have your own custom node implementation that is differs from the current public mining infrastructure, your own pool, and quite a lot of these custom built ASICs. Number two, it requires you to have each block's header hash modifiable, along with providing the extra data field, something again not provided by mining infrastructure today. And you need to be able to generate enough Ketchak to bypass those memory accesses within the block time of Ethereum, which is currently today between 12 and 14 seconds, depending on the network state. So this is an interesting thing that Least Authority, myself, and none of us actually thought about, given that we did not think you could mangle the extra data field in Ethereum like you can in Bitcoin. However, our proposed fix for this is actually to ensure that the seed mix right now, our proposed fix is to have the hash mix consume all 256 bits of the seed produced by that initial Ketchak round, while having the final Ketchak consume only 64 bits of the seed. So that ensures we have 256 bits of security throughout all stages of the hash, which is ideally have a continuous 256 bit of security every step of the way. This should be a really minimal fix, so it shouldn't have any effect on hashing performance. Andrea Lanfranchi and Jean M. Cyr have also been working on an alternate solution that instead would not need to increase the hash mix to 256 bits, and instead would ensure that both the first round and the last Ketchak would not be static, and they would continuously require other outputs, other inputs. And so we've put the proposed fix up on Gitter. We've also put, we've got a pull request on the ifdefelse GitHub repository for people to look and view. We've reached out to Solar Designer for comment. We've also reached out to the other people that have worked on ProgPow throughout its life cycle to also give sort of a review. Now, for how the light evaluation method works, this is specifically, let me just pull up the least authority audit. It's only feasible if you're able to generate enough dataset items on a tiny ASIC connected to a bunch of RAM. According to least authority, as long as we ensure that our dataset items are above 256, this would not be possible. And on a hardware level, it requires 100 megabytes of SRAM that you can access quite fast in very few cycles. And the ASIC specifically has to be built just to generate these dataset items over and over again. So their proposed fix is upgrade to 512. Two different attacks. One requires custom mining pool infrastructure, custom ASIC design, and to basically brute force the search space, and one requires to generate a bunch of DAG items.
Okay, was there a question? I heard someone get off mic.
I just wanted to say I participated more as moral support through their work on the exploit, and I was quite impressed. Just jumped right on it, quickly found the problem, quickly found a fix, and I've reviewed the PR. It's quite straightforward, quite clean, and shouldn't really cause any troubles with performance. So I'm quite happy with it.
And you're referring to the PR from the IfDefElse team or the PR from
on Kick's exploit. So that would be the first one she mentioned, not delightful.
Got it. Okay. Other people have comments or questions? Okay. Any other further technical stuff? Anybody?
Uh,
Go ahead, Martin.
Yes. So one thing that has been talked about a bit, but I don't think it has been discussed in this forum or any similar forum, is the fact that in April, apparently the DAG is going to go over 4 gigabytes, which will cause a drop in hash power because a lot of the E3, as I understand it, ASIC and Antminer E3 ASICs will not be able to cope with that, and it might be even Krista knows better, but might be somewhere around 40% that will be lost in that time. I just wanted that to be raised, and maybe it affects this discussion today.
I want to add on top of this. I was about to ask about the same question. I feel also about the community opposition that people imagine that mining in Ethereum exactly the same than mining on Bitcoin. And I just want to point out, and Christy will probably be able to confirm when confirm, that from my understanding is in Bitcoin, if tomorrow Bitmain comes to die, the mining will just keep going. Versus in Ethereum, we will have at some point a cliff where the ASIC would just drop out of that DAG size member issue. And I would love to have Christy's opinion on the topic and see if that's a good or bad reason not to go to ProgPow.
I can definitely highlight on that. So let me tackle your piece first, Lewis. So the DAG was really designed to ensure that there was a continual pressing need to phase out infrastructure with the hope of gently transitioning to proof of stake. Obviously, things take time, and that isn't really how it worked out in practice. I do think keeping the DAG as it is important. I do think that we are at the stage where most of the GPU infrastructure in Ethereum is slowly phasing out regardless, just because there's better equipment on the market. So most farms have slowly been upgrading. BBT can elaborate that on that more in a second because he's closer to the mining infrastructure to date. The E3 was specifically designed with 4 gigabyte of low profile DDR3, so it's not GPU VRAM. It uses a different kind of memory controller. We have not been able to confirm whether you could do a firmware fix to actually ensure that this device could stay on the network until October. The only confirmation we have that it will drop off on April was an email statement from Bitmain support that made its way into the media, stating it would no longer work in April, and asking people if they would like to purchase new ASICs. There's another device currently on the network, the A10. This uses GDDR6 memory. It has a different kind of memory controller. And we have confirmed with InnoSilicon that that will be hashing until October, but beyond that, it will fall off. And they have also started collecting orders for a 4.5 gigabyte version of the device. My concern with this is twofold. One, depending on the network, how many ASICs are on the network, Ethereum could suffer quite a sizable drop in net hash all at once, which would not be ideal for our block time. And it would play a little bit of havoc on that. I do hope it would recover fast. And I can talk a little bit about our models on the E3 in a moment. Two, I am concerned that this infrastructure that it continues to be rebuilt and put into the ETH 1.0 ecosystem is slowly pushing out GPUs, and it's designed for very short-term games. So a 4 to a 4.5 gigabyte upgrade, which is only roughly 8 months of mining time. So those are my two concerns on that front. And also the fact that no one right now, unless you're inside of China, is able to get access to Inner Silicon's updated machines, or as well as Bitmain's updated machines. BBT, are you able to elaborate a little bit on the mining infrastructure you see today and whether your thoughts on the DAG?
Can I ask a question before going to the mining infrastructure? I tried to ask it in a Gitter chat, but as was mentioned in an audit, it just requires around 100 megabytes of fast static like SRAM to make such DAG bypass attack feasible. But then there was a conclusion that this number of like this amount of memory is not available right now. But so far, it doesn't look that it's not available from a technology perspective, because it would just require to have 4 billion transistors, and this amount is negligible compared to everything which is available in modern processors.
Sorry, are
Is
you
there
referring to the least authority light evaluation method?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
You already went over it. I mean, right now, when you has mentioned that it should be required to have around 100 megabytes of fast, low latency memory on chip to do such bypass. So like, and this amount doesn't look high. And even if you increase it tenfold, the amount of transistors which would be required to implement such ASIC, as it also doesn't look enormous. And it still would be possible for someone who is really interested in doing this to actually make such a hardware. Or maybe is there any other argument what would potentially stop someone from doing this?
Happy to elaborate on that. So SRAM is quite expensive. It's not just about the transistor cost. It's also which company makes it, and also what is the current supply time and supply chain. So SRAM is about 20x the cost per bit as DRAM for these larger memory sizes. And it's also possible to get this kind of SRAM in a lot of the higher end FPGAs today, where it says URAM or block RAM. We have different types of RAM that we can configure as well. The biggest concern right there is it is not as accessible as you would think. Number one, due to those supply chains. SRAM is mostly used in other kinds of configurations. They have preference. Number two, it's not just about having the memory. It's about having the ability to do this at very, very low voltage and a very low power efficiency, because currently SRAM is very power hungry. It's quite power hungry. So it's a little bit of balance on the hardware side. And it's also much more feasible for an ASIC manufacturer to just ignore the SRAM right now and just go straight for the GDDR5 or G6, given that that is a much more cheaper, cost-effective solution, and it's easier to build and maintain. My concern specifically is that given that that kind of amount of SRAM is available in specific types of FPGAs, but not accessible to the broader community due to the lack of supply, due to the high price, that it would sort of centralize mining in that space. And that SRAM specifically is not available to all kinds of hardware. So it's not available in your GPUs, which would further widen that gap between your GPU miners and your ASIC miners. Again, the issue isn't that ASICs are bad or GPUs are good when it comes to hardware. It's just about supply chains. ASICs have very, very narrow supply chains that are hit harder by world effects. They're hit harder by, we've had the recent COVID that's affected the supply chain quite heavily. Many ASIC manufacturers had to cease doing any sort of operations or business for about a month. So there's effects there that do affect it, whereas your GPU and your CPU companies are much more cushioned to these kinds of effects.
My concern was about another strategy how to implement it, and it's not. It was actually about doing the custom ASIC chip, which has all this SRAM on it, not from external supplier. And actually never ever heard that SRAM is available as a separate chip. I mean, I thought about SRAM being implemented the same way as it's in the modern CPUs, where basically all the cache lines are just SRAM. And those are already in quite large amount. While the number of transistors still is like 4 or 6, it's not that different, transistors per cell, per bit. So in principle, if you would want to manufacture it at the current process levels, it will not be even that expensive, because the difficulty of the processors of such chips is much below the difficulty of even Pentium 4 from 10 years ago.
That is not true at all. Are you able to cite your sources on price? I mean,
I'm not. No. I mean that. I mean, from my perspective, if it's possible in principle to pull this and do the manufacturing, and I think people who would do who did some estimates for custom chips for VDFs, the price tag wasn't that high. Even maybe while they have smaller number of transistors, the process of manufacturing wasn't the most recent ones, but I think they had very reasonable amounts for something like 1 million per 1,000 and something, or even more chips at something like 18 or 12 or 18 or 20 nanometers. So it also depends on the scale. If someone would ever want to make it and produce it, there is it's possible from technology perspective, and it may put a higher price tag, but it wouldn't immediately rule it out as economically inefficient.
I agree that it is technically possible today. This is where I've pushed back on the least authority audit on that point. I do disagree that it wouldn't be economically viable, because the cost of your Ethereum ASIC isn't actually just that one little SRAM with 100 megabyte. So that doesn't get you like an hash ASIC. That's not how it would work. You would still need quite a large compute core, and you'd still need lots and lots of memory. This would just allow you to do a light evaluation method on the DAG itself. So you would still need to store the DAG somewhere. You're still going to want to parallelize it. You still have the cost of the silicon for the actual chips, and you still have to compete with, the SRAM, which a few of the fabs are able to do that do that process, but you still have to compete with that space. I'm not saying it's not feasible at all. However,
I did want to just time box this to another 6 minutes or so, but keep going, Christy.
No, I just wanted to state that, however, the working with SRAM isn't something that many, ASIC manufacturers have the experience with. We only have right now 2 that are really prominent in the Ethereum mining space, which is Bitmain and which is InnoSilicon. InnoSilicon has traditionally favored working with their GDDR6 because they control that memory PHY. Bitmain may very much be able to do this kind of SRAM ASIC, but that again isn't ideally what we want or what we hope for. It would give them and their machines a competitive advantage over everyone else, and you'd have a choked supply on those machines. The VDF ASICs, you quoted some price numbers there. That's not necessarily efficient when it comes to mining.
And then you had a thing for BBT, right, Christy? You were saying a few minutes ago.
Yes. So when it comes to the DAG, and actually, let's have an open discussion about the DAG. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? So 2 years ago, I believed that strongly that the DAG should be kept in place because we want that gentle transition over to Casper FFG. Obviously, things have changed quite vastly in 2 years. From my standpoint and my vantage point, most of the Ethereum mining structure has been on 4 gigabyte GPUs, but miners have steadily upgraded to 6 gigabyte GPUs as the surge of other kinds of applications have come into place. And just because of, they've ROI'd, they want to upgrade their infrastructure. BBT, how is it looking on your vantage point? And what are your thoughts on decreasing or increasing the DAG, as it were?
Well, a majority of the farms these days and the folks that I talk to, I mean, the current standard right now is the 1660 Ti. It's one of the best cost-effective GPUs out there to use, and that's at 6 gigabytes. So the natural progression, mind you, some of this technology that we're talking about is now going on 5+ years old with the RX 470s, 480s. In addition to the specialized mining GPUs, a handful of those are all 8 gig because of they were referenced off the 1070 with 8 gig. So, I wouldn't want to disrupt the current integration that has been done with ProgPow to then have a science project, being that it's tied very closely to at point of implementation, it would be at where the current block is. The block predicates the DAG size right now is the way it's referenced. Any kind of science project going through trying to readjust that I would say not be as fruitful versus where the current mining scene right now is from an upgrade standpoint. Navi being on the AMD side, the 7 nanometer stuff is all 8+ gigabyte, 8 to 16 gigabyte. So honestly, I think it's a moot point. I did bring in reference in a few of the last videos saying that technically it would be possible, but it comes down to at the end of the day, what's the least pain from the implementation standpoint? And I think leaving it the way it is would be still accepted, obviously, from the mining scene, from the state of the upgrades that we're at now. 2 years ago, this discussion probably would have been a little different. But now that we're there, I think most people are expecting the 4 gig to fall off in October.
Okay, do we have, we're going to wrap this up in just a couple minutes, the technical part of this, but based on what BBT just said, is there anyone in the call who has comments or questions on that?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. So basically, with the DAG going above 4 gigabytes and obsoleting a lot of the older GPUs, ProgPow doesn't do anything to fix that, correct?
Correct. It does not affect the DAG size at all.
Okay. Other people?
Yeah, just sorry, I'm a little confused. This is Amin. I thought I heard Martin Swend say that the E3 ASICs were going offline and the majority of the hash power was going to be a result of ASICs going offline. Could somebody comment on whether the majority of the expected hash power going offline is GPUs or ASICs?
Yeah, so this is in relation to a report that a white paper we've been working on where we have a posterior model that's actually able to take a specific nonce signal attributed with the E3s based upon Coinmetrics' previous research and actually give that a percentage number of what it would be for the network. And the report is currently in peer review, so a lot of people have been helping with the wording and the structure. We hope to get that out on the weekend. Happy to distribute it widely as long as people don't mock us too badly for our spelling mistakes.
You have like a
But based upon our assumptions, we believe that, and based upon the signals of the E3, we do believe that 40% of the network, or roughly 39.2% to 41.1%, belongs to the signal the E3 generates. When I say signal, I mean that specifically the E3 fixes 1 bit of the nonce at 0 for every single solution that they generate. And this, we theorize, we've seen this in ASICs before where it's a tracking pattern. So while an ASIC manufacturer may know how many devices they've sold, they don't actually understand what happened. They don't have any data when it leaves their warehouse and goes to their customers. So they're able to track it through pool They're able to track the distribution, and they're able to make estimates of when those devices will become end of life and when new machines need to phase out. We've seen this in some Bitcoin devices before. And based upon Coinmetrics research, they found out that the signal perfectly lines up with the announcement date of the E3, the first shipping date of the E3, and it extends back a year period into April 2017.
All right, so just putting this back in English, 40% of the hash power estimated from your report is going offline, and all of that is ASICs?
The signal that we are tracking, which we believe is tied to the E3, is 40% of the network.
And
Correct.
E3 is ASICs?
Tied to the E3, yes.
Okay.
Yes, the E3 is an ASIC. Yes.
Yeah, the E3 is a 4 gigabit ASIC, correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up the technical discussion. To go really quickly into this, let's first jump into just a couple minutes of Greg, you had a comment on the process, and I wanted to make sure you were heard on that since you've been vocal in the comments of the agenda on that. So if you wanted to just give your view real quick before we jump into community perspective, the Ben's compromise, the other things.
I don't think that's relevant until after we've heard from these people.
Okay, sounds good to me. We'll reorder that then. So let's go ahead and get to the part where we talk about community approval and dissent. So how this has worked before was in January of 2019, ProgPow was put in accepted state, and that was an indication from the core developers that it would be included in a future hard fork. It would move to final state once it is implemented on the network using a hard fork, network upgrade, whatever you want to call it. And since then, there's been the Istanbul hard fork and Mir Glacier that did not include ProgPow, and then recently it was brought up that because ProgPow is an accepted state, it would need to be included in a future hard fork. So since then, there has been dissent from the community, some of them feeling like that this was kind of sprung upon them, etc., from what I've gathered. So I kind of wanted to hear from the I guess we're just going to call it anti-ProgPow side, what your perspective on this dissent is and how you would kind of formulate it as a summary. And we can start with Martin if you have that opinion, and then if not, we'll go to Matt.
Sure, yeah, sure. So I would start short with why I personally was and am against it, then kind of the community perspective and kind of my perspective on the governance process. So yeah, well, I was from the very beginning against it and vocally against it, I believe. And it was never a technical opposition. It was just kind of I had never technical issues with the proposal. I just thought the proposal itself, the goals of the proposal, are nothing what I wanted, basically. So so my view on things is kind of the core promise of Ethereum is reducing the platform risk. So whatever people want to build on top of Ethereum or around Ethereum, they can do it, and they can have extremely high guarantees that what they build will not be made worthless by the platform making an arbitrary change. So I personally never had any investment with ASICs or whatsoever. I'm not invested in any form. But if I would have, or I could totally see that I 2 years ago would have made a decision to build an ASIC for Ethereum, and I would definitely not have felt that I would do something legit, kind of wrong or illegal. So if now the platform kind of decides to kick me off, I would totally feel screwed. So in my view, there can be exceptions, or there can be situations where, well, Ethereum has to make a change that affects users negatively. If it's an extremely clear advantage for Ethereum, or if it's a situation where the survival of the network is at stake. But in my view, as long as those things are not the case, then kind of those type of changes that badly affects some people should not be made. And with ProgPow, it's not even clear to me why ASIC resistance is in kind of why that would be a good thing. So there are a bunch of arguments that ASICs are in a way even closer to proof of stake, the thing that we all want in the long time, because ASICs kind of requires this capital upfront investment. So there are those arguments. Then there is this argument that it's not even clear whether ProgPow would guarantee ASIC. So first, it's not clear, do we want ASIC resistance? Second, it's not clear, does ProgPow achieve ASIC resistance? And well, this recent exploit that was published yesterday shows, well, it's quite likely that it was possible until recently to build an ASIC even under ProgPow, and it would make the situation much worse, because now, well, if ProgPow would have been implemented the way it was proposed until 2 days ago, the incentives, if you can then manage to build an ASIC, to not publish it and kind of to have it quite kind of this monopoly that we are afraid of, are much higher, because you would never want to share it, because you would know if you share or if kind of it becomes public that an ASIC exists, Ethereum would fork again. And basically, this guy who released this this report said something like, what was his words? I, of course, don't know him, but he was tweeting something like, "I finally decided to release it," or something like that. So clearly indicating that he or she was aware of it for a long time. And to me, it seems like the only reason why he now released it was because they were thinking, well, ProgPow is dead anyhow, and now I can say it. So to me, it seems quite likely that they had it in the well.
I'm gonna need to time box this just because we're running low on time.
So anyhow, those are some of my personal reasons to be against ProgPow, but at the current state, that doesn't matter. That doesn't, or that's not the critical thing. At the current state, the critical thing is that from where I sit, the majority of the community is against it. So there was this this letter, and just to name a few projects where either the founders or many of the people behind the project, Aragon, Synthetic, Status, Moloch, 0x, Maker, Uniswap, Augur, all of them have kind of come out against ProgPow, and I'm currently not aware of a single project building on Ethereum that says, yeah, well, we want ProgPow. So from where I'm sitting, the majority is against it, and even if that would not be the majority and just kind of a large minority, even that would be for me enough to say, well, we can't do ProgPow if there's not consensus to do it.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
sorry. Yeah. So to me, the conclusion is another question is the governance process broken or something like that? And to me, it's all perfectly fine. So to me, the criticism of Ethereum was sometimes a small committee is unilaterally making decisions, and in my view, kind of this small committee exists. It's this call we are now on, and it usually makes a decision, and people in community very much trust those decisions, and so far they have always kind of accepted it. And to me, it's kind of now a very positive thing that we actually see, well, there's not a blind trust, but there is still this kind of this the second step, that after this committee kind of makes a suggestion, that there's still this community approval, and kind of so far it always happens, and I expect it to happen most of the time in the future. But if once in a while stuff is rejected, then I think it should just be rejected and we should move on.
Okay. What I'm going to do here, just so that we can get through everyone speaking, is I'm going to have Matt kind of add on to that to wrap up not completely wrap up, but to wrap up this portion of the anti-side to give an overview, and then I'll get to Christy and BBT on their perspective on why it should go in, and any kind of quick rebuttal they have on that. So Matt, do you want to kind of add on to that with any of the thoughts that maybe were missed?
Sure, thanks, Hudson. Yeah, so I have a slightly different take. I'm actually not immediately technically against ProgPow. What I'm against is this kind of governance mishap of what felt like a closed issue to the community not actually being closed, what feels like something that is, I know it doesn't feel like it to you guys because you've been working on this for years, but moving way too quickly. And I do not think that the upside of ProgPow, which to me is unclear, is worth the downside of a community split. So that's really the crux of my argument outside of tech and outside of whether or not we think ASIC resistance is a valuable thing to have. I think that this is really showing us the cracks in governance. I don't blame any dev for being frustrated that there are random Twitter mobs that appear. But these things happen because there's not a great place to have these conversations, because many people in the community don't feel heard, and because, frankly, I mean, a lot of us who do pay attention to these calls and who have been on these calls in the past, we're still surprised that ProgPow is still a thing and still moving forward and still a topic of discussion. So I guess what I see here is a lot of parallels to what I saw in Bitcoin in 2016 and 2017. I saw a group of entrenched developers who were doing their best and trying to serve a project. I saw a bunch of unhappy companies who wanted something that may or may not have been better for the chain, and as well as a split with miners. And what I guess what I don't want to see is, you know, this will fall back to how crypto governance always falls back, which is voice or exit. Right now we have community members who are trying to voice. We're being told that this isn't the right platform. This isn't the right platform. Everywhere we try to talk, there's not a right place. We're being denigrated and called, I mean, you know, just like influencers, I guess. There's an assumption that none of us are technical or not, in my case, a professional engineer. There is, so there's just this real split. And I'd like to see us step back from that and reconsider whether the social split is worth pushing an uncertain technical improvement, or if we want to go the other way, which is exit. I do know that there are at least 2 teams who are ready to support clients that do not include ProgPow. I do think that it shouldn't go that way. And then I guess my last point is, you know, in the past on a chain like Bitcoin, a lot of these, you know, we had SegWit2x and we had a bunch of communities try to come together and sort of like force a hard fork in Bitcoin, and it didn't work. And for Bitcoin, that was great. But in Ethereum, we have a ton of incredibly stateful projects that I believe will actually be the ones to decide the majority chain. I believe that Tether, Maker, any security tokens, all of these folks have a huge economic incentive to be on the right chain. And if they decide that is a no ProgPow chain, it's going to be painful. So personally, I think that we should avoid the issue. And I think that we should either work on a much smaller tweak if we believe that ASIC resistance needs to happen. It could even be something that happened semi-annually, or spend the next year actually educating the community, consider rebranding ProgPow, and convince the stakeholders that feel like they've been cut out of this process that this is the right move, and maybe we can kind of heal the rift. So that's my thing.
Okay, we'll start with the BBT and get your perspective, and then Christy and whoever else on the call wants to speak.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I want to kind of actually echo some of what you were just saying there at the end, Matt. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to a health of a network. And I think, as I would say, an outsider from the technological side of it, initially being very skeptical of it 2 years ago, doing my own testing on this particular algorithm, trying to deep dive onto some of the other, ancillary effects that would happen with changing, from ETASH. At the end of the day, it comes down to the community understanding, from a platform side, what's worth the risk. And being in this space and being in mining since 2011, seeing the different phases of GPUs, ASICs, FPGAs, it comes down to the stability of the network and what's best for the transition when things go to ETH 2.0. And everything in my space is telling me from my experience that if there's an environment that gets created that limits the exposure, the risk of an infraction or a split is far greater. And so, I mean, I look at it from a participation standpoint, the ability to participate on this network or not, nothing more, nothing less. Taking a more, conditioned approach that involves the community members. They've said what they're concerned with from a stability standpoint. This being kind of dark for a little bit and then just being reintroduced. I mean, even for myself, not tracking, I thought it was essentially dead in the water. And then we talked that, hey, it's going to go forward. I understand the perspective and I respect the concern that the community is talking about. I think on the other hand, also, we have a situation where, yes, we have a high confidence that a majority of the network, or not a majority, let's say 40%, at the end of the day, in April, we're going to know the impact of the ASICs that were on there. At that point in time, if there was a decision to move forward with any fork, when you're looking at one community, ironically, that's the time to do it, because now you don't have the infiltration of this other, ASICs, FPGAs, anybody else that's involved in this at that time, right? You don't have that contention of one hardware versus another of splitting. I would say that we would take the next month and really breaking down the concerns for Maker and everybody else that's on there from a participant, a developer on this network, to understand at the end of the day, as we're still holding proof of work, it is still ETH 1.0, that a rebranding of making something like ProgPal plus all the fixes that we're talking about, the kick discovery, all inclusive of an ETH 2.0, and continue to pound on it and make sure that it's the right thing for everybody. We need to get everybody on the same page. Bottom line, this thing is not going to go forward if you have a majority of your contributing ecosystem on this platform against it. But I want to make sure that everybody has a clear and concise understanding of what happens if you've centralized or allowed the centralization due to the supply chain. There's nothing against ASICs. I have nothing personally against ASICs. I've said this for years on my videos. But it is the fact of the matter of limiting the participation. And then you're going to have a huge economic incentive to not, move to something like ETH 2.0.
And
so,
I need to time box this one.
Yep. I mean, just bottom line, I mean, I'll produce my findings, everything that I have related to this subject. I'll put it on a Medium. We can have a more civil discussion, but I kind of echo Matt's piece with regards to, let's make sure we can answer some of the growing concerns. But I think for the health of Ethereum and for the ability for individuals to be able to participate in this space as they've done since 2015, that understand the vision of 2.0, that it's a healthier narrative to move towards the ability to participate. And I'll let
Yeah, let's have Christy take it over, and then Ben can discuss real quick what he's written up and kind of get the feeling of the room among the participants and the core devs, what we're feeling here. So, Christy, go ahead.
Sure. So I want to start by stating that ProgPal was really developed due to the ecosystem that was around in 2018. There were numerous EIP proposals around ASIC resistance when the E3 had first been leaked by a CNBC analyst. And we were a little frustrated by each proposal because they were short-term band-aids on a much longer-term problem. Most mining algorithms have not been correctly designed for hardware, and thus coin networks often get decimated by these devices, and then they lose their community and a lot of their value. Ethereum was a different beast in 2018. In 2020, we have a significant portion of dApps that are now dependent on a stable network. And the last thing we want to do is actually have a chain split. My biggest concern is ensuring that we're at a time right now where new investment is going into the 1.0 chain. Based upon my vantage point in the community, and I do some work on some research projects right now, 2.0 related, we know that 1.0 needs to be as secure as it can, possibly, for the foreseeable future. I don't see it suddenly disappearing in 6 months. And so I would like to see a very secure 1.0 chain. I would also like to see the 1.0 chain be something that all sorts of devices and all participants can use, given that mining is very much a user onboarding experience into cryptocurrency. And there have been multiple videos and content produced in the last 2 weeks with miners telling their stories of how they discovered Ethereum. Mining often acts as a gateway drug for that. And so really the intention of ProgPow, and agreed, Matt, we should have just called it at hash 2.0. Really the intention is, number one, to strengthen at hash as an algorithm to help ensure that the original goals stated in the yellow paper are met, and to help ensure that the playing field is leveled between a fixed function mining ASIC and a GPU ASIC. And so that eventually, if people do build mining ASICs, it does not push off your GPU community. It does not gateway. It doesn't block miners coming into the ecosystem and new participants coming in and earning Ether, and ensure that it remains an onboarding experience for the ecosystem. I will state that right now ProgPow is in its proposal period. It needs to go through implementation and testing after implementation. It needs more eyes on it, and I think the last 2 years, a lot of the people that have worked on ProgPow have simply gotten burnt out because, as Solar Designer summarized it best in the Zcash grant, when he was working on reviewing ProgPow, he said that he's losing motivation because if you don't know whether your work will be seen or adopted, you slowly lose a lot of motivation to keep spending time on it. I do think if a path is put forward where we say, hey, we want to strengthen the 1.0 chain, we can get a lot more community feedback. We can get a lot more people working towards solving this problem. And we can get a lot more eyes on the proposals as well. And nothing is ever perfect. And finally, I do not believe that that ProgPow should be treated like any other technical upgrade, but it needs to be done in a way where all participants in the ecosystem are comfortable and understand what the repercussions may be and how it works. And again, echoing Matt's statement, we have not done a very good job on educating people on the mining community as a whole, and how mining really does strengthen an ecosystem for a coin.
Okay, and then finally, Ben, let's get your just quick summary on what your proposal was. And by the way, we started real late, at least 10 minutes late, I think, so this probably will go a little over the top of the hour.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick on the proposal and the motivation behind the proposal. As I mentioned a while back in my intro, I really don't have a strong opinion about ProgPow. I can see both sides of the issue, and I think there's an argument to be made on each side. I think a lot of the kind of considerations are unsettled or open research questions in terms of what the impact of ASICs are on the long-term health of the network, on the transition to ETH 2.0. And I really think it's kind of a toss-up, and I think that's why the split has occurred. If it was a clear if there was a clear answer one way or the other, I think the community would come to consensus around that. And since there's not, I think we've seen this kind of divide. Given that this divide exists, though, and that people on each side are very convinced, I don't think the path forward anymore is to simply expect that one side is going to convince the other, at least not in the short term, or at least without new information becoming available in terms of effect on the network, or impact, or new ASICs being developed, or things along those lines. So given that, I think that the way forward it sounds like everybody, I think it's clear everybody wants to avoid a chain split. And I think it's also clear that everybody wants to have the best outcome for Ethereum, the best security for the network, and the clearest path to a transition to Ethereum 2.0. So given those kind of those common grounds, even though we disagree on some of the details on what the best path forward is there, and we're unlikely to convince each other, then a compromise solution where no one is particularly happy, but we focus in on those shared goals seems like the best possible path forward. Given that, the proposal that I put forward is basically one where ProgPow should be fully implemented and tested across all the major clients, but that it should not be included as part of the Berlin or any other future upgrade hard fork. Instead, the client should be implemented such that there's a command line switch which enables ProgPow to be enabled by the operator of the node at a specific block height specified by that operator. In addition, a ProgPow enabled hard fork of the Robson test network should be created and maintained using that switch. So we would have a full-blown testnet, Ethereum testnet using ProgPow that all clients would have to support and function properly with henceforth. And then the final point here is that a strong shelling point should be encouraged in the Ethereum community, that if there was ever clear evidence of an ASIC-led attack on the network, that Ethereum stakeholders would coordinate to activate an emergency hard fork at an agreed upon block height using the switch that was implemented. So the reasoning here is that, again, because we share those goals to secure the network and keep it decentralized and transition successfully to Ethereum 2.0, we focus on achieving that and using ProgPow and recognizing all the work that's gone into ProgPow and its goals, but instead of using it as the active mining algorithm on the network, which right now is possibly risky and doesn't have clear upside to the point that several people have made. Instead, we use it more as a kind of sword of Damocles or a sort of insurance policy. So essentially, if ASIC miners do attempt to thwart Ethereum 2.0, or if there is any other kind of clear attack on the network, we have a very ready option to hard fork the network quickly and with the coordination of the community and coalescing around the idea that that would be necessary. Now, a couple of points folks have brought up weaknesses in this proposal. One is, what is that clear signal? How do we recognize when a so-called attack is happening on the network and when a split needs to occur? I think that it would be valuable to have more conversation around this. That said, I don't think there is any way to fully lay out exact criteria ahead of time for what that would entail. If there was, we could just encode that. We could write the code to do that ourselves. It is almost by definition a value judgment. And so in some sense, this doesn't completely end the debate around ProgPow. It attempts to push off ever needing to use it on the network by adjusting the incentives of would-be ASIC attackers, but it does leave open the door to the possibility that continued debate and discussion will occur around if a hard fork should occur due to what is perceived by some as an attack, but perhaps as others as not. I don't think that there's any way around this. At the end of the day, we're either going to have a chain split, or we're going to coalesce as a community around a clear need to do one thing or the other. And so what this does is, hopefully avoids that future ever taking place, but at least gives us a path forward right now that recognizes the work of ProgPow, attempts to leverage it in a way that better secures the network and the future of the network, and and then allows us to continue the process, the messy process of decentralized governance down the road. So that's the summary, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I have a comment on that.
Sure.
So one thing that I think is an underlying assumption with this compromise model is that in the event of an activation of ProgPow on a short notice, there will be GPU hash power standing by ready to take over the mining. And I think that may not be true. I think they will be slower to actually reestablish themselves for Ethereum mining if some time goes by.
I think that's a fair point and an open question. I don't, I mean, I guess the worst case is that the difficulty drops very low, and so the reward, that's a clear incentive for GPU miners to come online and come back onto the chain. Obviously, there would have to be some degree of coordination around this anyway, so I imagine that large GPU mining pools would be aware of it ahead of time, but we wouldn't know until it happens. Again, the intention of the proposal is that this option would never have to be used, but that it would be used in the case of a clear emergency where the downside risk on to the network due to an attack of some kind was so clear that these kinds of risks in terms of available GPU hash power were worth taking as opposed to dealing with the status quo.
Martin, where's this concern coming from? So my current understanding is that currently the assumption is that right now today, 60% are GPUs and 40% are ASICs, and it's quite likely that actually the ASICs will, won't work in 2 months anymore. So we will then have a significantly higher share than of GPUs. So where does the concern come from that there are no GPUs available?
Well, so I guess the concern is not in 2 months' time, but more like maybe a year from now. If there, I mean, obviously the S3 will have to be replaced, and there will be new developments happening, and
right.
I would assume that a larger portion becomes ASICs and GPU.
Right. I mean that brings me to another point that I was always saying. Okay, we should focus on proof of stake, and we should focus on starting to communicate a transition period to proof of stake, where mining rewards kind of are decreased over time, because that alone would prevent people from now doing large investments in 6 or 8 gigabyte ASICs. So as long as now there is a somewhat clear path that, let's say, within the next 1 or 1.5 years, or at least the transition or the decrease of mining rewards starts towards proof of stake, then I think that's a much more effective way to mitigate this ASIC dominance.
Do we have a solid engineering plan for that transition?
Bit early for that, I'd say.
That's where time should be spent on. And
it could be 2 years, it could be 4 years. We don't know.
Well, that's why we should spend time on that one and not on ProgPow.
Actually, the same could be said about implementing ProgPow as an option for the mainnet, because the proposal's weakest point is that it already assumes that all the developers of all the clients are willing to actually implement this readiness for the switch, because there are a lot of other EIPs that need attention right now, and I'm not sure if ProgPow is the most important to the network of them.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to weigh in briefly there. I mean, my understanding, so as a software engineer, I'm not deeply embedded in the development of any of the clients, ETH 1.0 or 2.0, but just as a software engineer, I don't think you can just assume that the development time is fungible like that. It's just not how it works. So I think that's a little bit of a non sequitur, or not as critical as a point as some might think.
And I believe that ProgPow is coded in Go. It's pretty far along. I think we got estimates before that it would take about a month for the current ProgPow to be coded. Can anyone remember if that's right?
No, it's like days. What do you mean?
Or
It's
well, for
currently
every client to like like get it in there, test, join Gangnam or whatever other test network.
I
think at this
For
point,
some context, the Geth PR is 40 lines.
Yep.
So it's actually, as far as clients go, it's a trivial change to make.
And fixing ProcPal bugs, is that a trivial change too?
The ones we have
as
currently,
bugs
yeah.
are- As bugs are discovered, it takes roughly, as you saw with our response to this one, it takes roughly 6 hours, and then it's a lot of careful testing. Yes, they're trivial to fix. Again, ProgPow is actually not that many lines of code. It's just tweaks to the @hash algorithm. And Martin Swende is probably Swinde is probably the best person to talk about the work required to put it into a client, since he did he implemented in Geth. Martin, are you able to comment on how long that roughly took you?
I think I did it in a couple of days or a week, but I was also basing it off your the Golang implementation that you guys had.
Which was not ideal. It was pretty bad. That was my work. Sorry.
Yeah, and Pavel implemented it in CPP, and Andre Silva did it in Rust, and I think they were more from ground up, especially Andre Silva.
I just wanted to remind people that like a hard fork is not just, it's clearly not just a technical process. So a hard fork basically means creating a narrative around it, kind of convincing roughly 20,000 people at the same time to convince them that this is the best thing to do right now. And in that sense, every hard fork costs kind of community and attention. And yeah, as said many times, I think this attention should be spent on many other ERPs like gas, change in the gas pricing, switch to proof of stake. That's where the scarce resources community attention.
Totally hear that. But correct me if I'm wrong, but for instance, in Istanbul or Berlin, aren't those, bundled EIPs that then become technical upgrades, which is technically a hard fork?
Yeah, that you're defining it correctly, in my opinion.
Can I just add a question for the no ProgPow part of the discussion, coming from the drop we're going to see in a month. I have something and think that, I mean, I'm neutral on the topic and just kind of worried in the future if ProgPow doesn't get accepted or if we drop ASIC resistance in the following case. We are going to see, according to Christie's numbers, 40% of the hash power. And because of the way hashing works in Ethereum, it means that somewhere in the future, we're probably going to kick out the entire GPU's economy from our ecosystem. And we are going to be dependent on ASIC maker to keep making ASIC. And this might, because compared to opposition to Bitcoin, ASIC get deprecated after a certain amount of time. Aren't we putting the network at risk that at some point the price of ETH is not interesting enough for those makers, for those constructors to make those machines and to have the network go, I mean, stop.
Sorry, so your first concern is soon 40% will drop, and then your next concern is, oh, we will only have ASICs. Wait, the 40% drop is ASICs dropping out. So that would mean more.
One kind of ASIC.
No, the other ones, GPUs are dropping out too, Martin.
Sure, but
no,
yeah, my concern going to express in April, we're going to see A3 Bitcoin A3 dropping, which means, according to Christie's numbers, 40% of the network. If we go this way, and I don't know if Christie can give us GPU values out like today, what the video is remaining. If we leave it that way, it means that probably we're going to kick out all the remaining GPUs by the...
Wait. So 40% drop out of some ASICs will first of all mean higher profitability for GPUs. So it will mean kind of GPUs can longer run or more of them run. So that will first of all be a good thing for GPU miners.
Great. But my point is not there. Is if we are living, I mean, it means that the other ASIC is going to be also more profitable, so they're going to produce more. And at some point, being GPUs, because they're less efficient, will be not as profitable and running, as running an ASIC. Could you agree with me on this one?
No. I mean, I really don't see why we wouldn't have any GPUs anymore.
Here,
The ASICs drop out.
The main reason why ASIC resistance might be important to Ethereum is because we do not want to become 100% dependent on ASICs to do all the mining. And as far as I understand, ProgPow is mostly that, like, by leveling the playing field between GPUs and ASICs in a certain way, it means that basically, like, we will basically continue to have GPU-based mining on Ethereum. If in the long run, GPU mining becomes way less efficient than mining with an ASIC because the ASICs keep getting better or whatever, and basically we'll be a bit screwed because people won't deploy their GPUs on Ethereum anymore.
In the long run, we should really switch to proof of stake. I mean, it's like,
I just would
so
like to
as someone who is
interject.
working on the switch to proof of stake, I can kind of tell you that, like, yeah, never mind.
But Martin, can I just comment on one point you say about moving to proof of stake? As I'm working on ETH1x, in my day-to-day, ETH1x should be a contingency plan for if anything goes wrong in ETH 2.0. And we should think about ETH1 day-to-day, independently of ETH 2.0, in my opinion, at least. Because we are going to do any change to make the transition happen. But in the meantime, ETH1x should still exist until proven wrong, until proven that we don't need it anymore. My concern I'm expressing is if we are killing the GPU economy by not moving to a different algorithm, I don't care about ProgPow, then aren't we going to be dependent on the supply chain of a small number of ASIC makers, which can, at the position of Bitcoin, because ASIC go obsolete technically, shouldn't we either stop this growth of the DAG or move to another algorithm? That's basically my question.
Lewis is actually correct. And to talk specifically to the 4 gigabytes that are about to knock off the current E3s on the network, your best time right now, or our best time, is to get these fixes in, propose ETASH 2.0, and change before more capital investment is invested into creating those ASICs, because the incentive is there when nothing is done, and more ASICs will be created, and we'll have a situation where we're going to be re-talking about this with some of the I wouldn't even call it anti-ProgPow, just forking off people's capital hardware, right? Because I mean, people are making investments where you have a natural attrition right now about to occur, where you're going to have a majority of GPUs on the network not having ASICs on the network. But the longer we wait, we're going to have ASICs on the network, and then we're going to be right back in that circular argument of, well, we don't want to reduce these people's capital investment. So that's kind of I hear the argument of saying, well, GPUs are going to become more profitable. It's not about that. The incentives are built in, and the equilibrium gets created around power, cost, OpEx, around either ASICs or GPUs. The bottom line is we have a known event that is going to occur here in the next month, where you're going to have a majority of one particular capital investment that's going to fall off the network. So I think the discussion should be, if we're going to move forward with having some algorithm adjustment, we should start moving into that to de-incentivize that activity of, hey, we're moving forward with an algorithm change, and it's probably not going to be economically incentive to do this particular algorithm with the ASIC, be it ETASH 1.0, but ETASH 2.0, here's the spec and standard we're moving to. If you're going to make any capital investment, you should start planning for that. And now you have a level playing field, and you have ASIC makers that can start making particular pieces of hardware for ETASH 2.0 with it.
What was that comment, Amin?
Said the same thing 3 times. I'd just like to jump in here, state some opinions, some of which just seem so obvious. It's like kind of gut wrenching that I even have to. First of all, ProgPow people, it's a bunch of profit-seeking miners lobbying the core dev political committee to get what they want, right? Full stop, that's what this is. Second thing, as a proof-of-stake maximalist, I'm very excited by the prospect of miners becoming stakers, but I have absolutely no sympathy for miners of the GPU or ASIC variety. In the long term, the intention has always been to show them the door. I don't really see why they feel entitled to a say in governance. The core devs that have so far been trigger happy with ProgPow have not accurately taken into account the risk of bugs. I no longer believe they are to be trusted, especially given the exploit that was revealed recently only when the person thought the ProgPow wasn't going to move forward. Anybody who thinks that code change is trivial is not taking this seriously. Another point is last year when I was responding to ProgPow, the claim from the core devs was it's just me, right? Me personally, me and me and a handful of Twitter people. This is not what they would categorize as contentious. But now there are far more people outspoken against it, including the CEOs of both Synthetics and Compound, which are like the second and third largest DeFi dApps respectively. Not to mention Koppelman's comment that not a single DApp team has come out pro ProgPow. And it's like, what have you guys been doing for a year if you haven't been able to convince a single DApp team to come out and be like, yes, we would, we want this, right? And then further, it seems like really silly to risk a chain split in the short term by implementing ProgPow in order to avoid the risk of a chain split later from ASICs. When we transition proof of stake, it's like, sort of madness.
I think for your third point, there's no one suggesting that we do it anytime soon. And
Yeah,
there's no one suggesting that, in fact, people are more suggesting more compromise toward figuring things out.
Right. So just let me finish one more point, is that I actually support Ben's compromise, despite having him blocked on Twitter. I don't know, probably said something that pissed me off a while ago. But I support the compromise to keep ProgPow in our back pocket and use it eventually, because for me, assuming, irrespective of really the 40%, whatever E3 is going offline, like that only actually makes this argument stronger. Is that there's no good reason to do ProgPow right now, right? Like there's really no good reason why you should do it right now, because the main argument for putting it in place is really that it'll fuck with the ROI calculations of ASIC miners, right? If it's not worth it for me to deploy an ASIC right now because I believe that ProgPow is going to go in 6 months or 9 months or 1 year, then it's as good as doing it today. So anybody who is pro ProgPow should have the opinion of let's do this, in 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, because like that's actually the best for network security. But because they are profit interested miners, they're saying no, let's get this done as soon as possible, right? They wanted to get this done last year before they even realized that there was a bug in it. It's like all of these positions, not necessarily the people, but the positions are sort of insane if you actually try to align them with the stated goals, but make a ton of sense if you just assume these are profit interested people.
Can I just one question to you? In that case, would you agree on freezing the DAG size?
I don't know. I haven't given it too much thought.
If I may, I have a question. Is anyone from the ProgPow camp, aside from from those who already use Go Ethereum implementation, are they willing to fund development of ProgPow in other clients, for example, Open Ethereum? Because I mean, there has been a lot of talk about what other clients are like supposed to do. To if I may finish, sorry.
I think it's not, the funding is not the problem.
Yeah, it's already in parity / Open Ethereum, just to be clear.
Yes, but if any bugs prop up, who's going to fix that?
The Open Ethereum team, unless
we will do that. We can do that.
Yeah,
it's not the technical problem and the funding problem.
So one problem I think that comes up a lot is like, yes, working on ProgPow is not mutually exclusive with working on ETH2. But one thing it is mutually exclusive on is like, time on these calls, significant like mental energy from a lot of people in the community. and I guess if we spend another year trying to debate this and coming up with a EThash 2.0 or ProgPow 1.1 or whatever, I think that's one thing we want to try and do better. And personally, I think this is why I'd almost be more in favor of something like Ben's proposal, because at least it gets us to commit to something fairly quickly. And kind of, how can we reduce like just the argument time so that we don't spend half the core devs call for the next year discussing ProgPow.
Yeah,
so it sounds like everyone is in favor of the flag, right? So can't we all just agree to implement the flag and then
Yeah, and
move
do the
on?
other part where we actually come up with some sort of agreement for when we think that we should trigger the flag. Otherwise, we're just going to make it really, 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 really easy for anyone to organize a chance point.
Yeah, that sounds. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, for the record, I also think kind of having it available kind of in case of an ASIC attack, sure, that there's nothing that hurts with that, but implementing as a flag definitely makes the likelihood of a split higher, because there are definitely entities, including exchanges, Poloniex, that have an incentive in splits and kind of a new coin.
So in that case, it's basically going to remain in the exact same state it is in right now, where basically we have implementations which are kind of ready to deploy. There might be, some more work that could go into that, but we basically have, like in most clients, there is an implementation that could be included at any time behind the flag or not, to, make ProgPow work.
Yeah.
Well,
so we are already at the stage where we basically have it. It's just not, we just don't officially have it.
So Peter, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask that if we, just merging some version of ProgPow into every client and then waiting for some event to trigger it, I think that's a bit dangerous, because what's the guarantee that ProgPow still works in 5 years' time? I just said a number, if somebody decides to trigger it. So if we want to go down that path, then I would possibly maybe suggest running a testnet with ProgPow, just so that the code is actually live somewhere. Otherwise, it will just deprecate. Somebody will just accidentally refactor something, break it, and nobody will notice until we actually want to use it.
That's part of my proposal, and that's specifically why it's part of my proposal. So I think we should have a fork of the Robson testnet that implements ProgPow, and that all clients should have to support that testnet moving forward.
So there's a lot of talk about ProgPow, not ProgPow, do ProgPow, but something that we haven't talked about, and I'd like to hear from the anti-ProgPow team, is the EThash vulnerability, which is the light hash evaluation method, wasn't known, and it is now known. And to that camp, is that something that's worth addressing? Like, is having a patch that vulnerability as part of EThash something that they're interested in without actually separate from the issue of ProgPow?
And then we need to hear from the pro side too, just as rebuttal for that. But yeah, go ahead, Anti.
So the key first step here is that this was released, if I'm correct, with the Bob Rao audit last year. And it's kind of just sat there. Some people knew about it and were aware of it, but it hasn't been communicated in any depth to the general public, why they should care about this, why this is a significant concern. So if we are going to move forward with an EThash patch, that would be the first step. I don't think we're anywhere near that, and it's going to seem like kind of a bait and switch at the last minute. Well, actually, there's an EThash vulnerability that has to be patched.
Well, I've been trying to have this conversation, but it gets very smashed down by ProgPow and then a whole bunch of things. So that's why I'd like to specifically address this.
Yeah, what's the chance of that becoming an issue, I suppose, if anyone can comment on that from a technical level, or has it already been implemented? And
the willingness of the anti-ProgPow team to, is that a valuable proof of work change? Because I can hear from them that it isn't, that ProgPow isn't a valuable change, but is patching EThash's vulnerability a valuable?
I just want to be clear. I don't necessarily think ProgPow isn't a valuable change. It's just I'm weighing how valuable it is relative to a community split, how valuable it is relative to the education campaign that needs to happen, and the additional diligence that needs to happen before we do it. So, you know, I do think that it's a lot more palatable to have a tweak to ETH-hash. I'm not proud, with my engineering hat on, that something like that would be easier than maybe something that we think is better and more forward-looking. But so anyway, I don't know if I would support it. Obviously, the details matter a lot, but I'm not against smaller ETH-hash tweaks to fix faults.
So the only James, the only point I would make is this light evaluation method, correct me if I'm wrong, it basically removes the memory hardness, or allows ASICs to bypass the memory hardness of ETH-hash, which means there can be ASICs on the network, which a lot of the anti-ProgPow side isn't necessarily opposed to already. Is that correct?
This is a very different brand of ASICs, and like a 10x more powerful ASIC is very different than a 1.2 or 1.5 or a 2x, which is what we've seen. So is that a concern? I guess, I mean, I just really like to hear from Martin if a proof of work change that patches a vulnerability to ETH-hash is a palatable thing for him and the community he represents.
I don't represent any community, and I can't make an opinion about something I haven't heard about it, and I don't have an opinion about it.
So we'll have to ask the broader community through like ETH magicians, and actually a lot of what we're talking about today will probably culminate on like Ben's ETH magicians post and other posts that'll pop up. So I highly encourage people to jump on there and avoid trolls, because the ETH magicians forum is generally avoided by trolls because it's dense. So yeah, so at this point, we've gone well over time. So to wrap it up, we don't have a process in place for putting an EIP on hold for the accepted state that it's in right now, or reverting it, I suppose. I don't think we have a process for that that's super clear. So because of that, we need to discuss that process today and what the core developers want to do, because despite anything the community wants to do, the EIP process currently dictates that the core developers decide what state a core EIP is in. So obviously they need to take perspective from the community. The community does have a say in this from a collaborative perspective, but they don't change the status of the EIP. So is there anyone with an appetite to try to pragmatically change the state of the EIP, or pragmatically not change the state of the EIP?
All I would say about it, no pro or con, just that it's in the accepted state. If we want to move it to another state, we need a consensus of the core devs to do that.
I'll do it.
I mean, you're not a core dev.
Can I be a core dev?
No, you're not a core dev.
I know.
Yeah, so Martin,
Hudson, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Just because, so the EIP is in an accepted state, is there anything in the EIP process as it stands right now that says a time frame in which an accepted EIP has to move into a hard fork?
There's none.
No.
So one option here is what we call a pocket veto, at least in the U.S. government, which is kind of to say it's an accepted state, but we choose never to move it out of that state, right?
That's good until we reform the EIP process. That would be something I'd like. From a process perspective, that sounds palatable to me, honestly.
We could do something like that we did this morning earlier this morning with the BLS precompile, where they're working on a new proposal and have that be a new EIP, and we can have ProgPows be, I forget what the word is, but there's a word for replacing one EIP with it.
Superseded.
Yeah, superseded. So we could supersede ProgPow with the updated version that Christie's using in conjunction with Ben's proposal.
Yeah, that would be ETH-hash 2 or something like that. It would not be called ProgPow.
And then the deployment as far as Ben's, as that coalesces and the unknown questions are answered, have that be a part of that.
Yeah. And then as far as the point on wasting time in the core dev meeting, on the subject, we just need better offline coordination from both a community governance perspective that I know a lot of people have been talking about lately. Maybe having a community call that's similar to the all core dev call that lends legitimacy and makes sure that the community is heard. Not to blame the core devs for this. They have a ton on their plate. They have a lot of pressure and they can't be on Twitter all day like a lot of us can. Um, so it's not a situation where they're, you know, like purposefully ignoring anyone's side, in my opinion. I think that what's happened here is miscommunication, not enough community involvement from both a community perspective and from us including the community. So that can be fixed in the future. Um, and I think we're going to find over the next few months and over the next year that that can be amended. And once that is amended, we can better answer some of these unknowns with forums and other areas where we can discuss this better. Any comments on that or ideas? Not necessarily to solve the whole thing, but like, is this something that we can be in agreement on from both sides?
I have a quick comment about the
Yeah.
EIP stuff. First of all, ProgPal, the actual EIP is still in draft. Second, it's never been accepted. It was tentatively accepted, and based on the audit, we never moved it past that to accepted after the audit.
We actually
And then
did at a further meeting.
we did move it to accepted because it's still on
Yes.
the EFI list.
Oh yeah, no, that's because the champions kept not being champions on it. They had to keep dropping out, and so no one changed the status. But Bitsby Trippin is going to change the status on that to accepted. It's a procedural issue more than not being accepted.
Yep.
How do I become a core dev?
We'll talk about that offline.
Okay.
So I think we'll wrap up the call. I think we've made a lot of progress today. And yeah, is there any final comments or things like of that nature before we jump off and we can say the next meeting is in 2 weeks on the 20th?
So what's the final status of the EAP?
Right now it's an accepted state and nothing has been changed on that. There's been a suggestion to make this what would be considered in the US a pocket veto and then to supersede it once another improved version of algorithm comes out, such as ET-2 or other things that are amended and explored in memory hard, etc. So there's been some suggestions, but no further movement on the EIP today.
So it remains an accepted status.
Correct. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think for these all court of calls, we've all always been kind of courteous to each other. And I think we have a certain implicit code of conduct, which I think Amin has violated kind of heavily today. And I just want to put it out there because I don't think that's okay for these calls.
I completely agree, and I'll be talking to Amin after this and probably putting in more things to prevent this in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to know exactly which parts of the code of conduct I violated because I thought I was showing enormous amounts of restraint.
Sure, we can talk about that after because we don't have any more time today.
I just wanted to thank you guys for having the discussion here. I know that this maybe feels like repurposing the call, but I know a lot of us appreciate it. So.
I just have a few questions to ask. So things that would really help me understand what it is that the ProgPow side needs to do is guidelines on what education would be helpful to the broader community as a whole. And feel free to throw it out there in Twitter or on Ethmagicians. I would like us to have some form of discussion about do we even need to the whole point of changing @hash or changing ProgPow is all once again on the thought of do we want ASICs on the network? Are we ASIC resistant or not? And it stems back to that principle of the yellow paper. And so I think that really has to be the question that we answer collectively as a community before we go down and do any further investment or work. So it would be really helpful for me to understand what kind of things would you like to see from the ProgPal team? What kind of educational materials would be helpful? And how else can we be of assistance for people that have questions or want to understand what the value of strengthening leveling the playing field on a mining algorithm may be.
Yeah, I can one-to-one flip this question and ask, what else do you want to see from the community to finally decide to not further kind of talk about ProgPoW and try to push it?
Yeah, I also want to add, I also want to add to this. I think you also maybe underestimate the community a bit. So I think the last weeks have been helping a lot to educate the community, and I think those that have been signing the petition, I think they are well aware of all arguments that have been made. So I think it comes really down to the question, do we want to be ASIC resistant or not? And I think those that have signed the petition, they are willing to take this eventual risk that there is. So I am worried a bit that this is this discussion can go on for a very long time, and it could be a waste of time.
Understood. EIP 2538 or whichever the EIP was, the letter that you're referring to did miss a lot of the arguments. You know, it's not about it's not about favoring one group over the other. It's about leveling. And I'm just wanting to understand, since the pushback is that we haven't produced the right, there hasn't been enough education. Are there actual items?
To clarify that part, Christy, what Trent was saying, that there hasn't been education on the vulnerability of Ethash as the right evaluation method. And so that should be something that should be addressed. So
got it.
That being, and I don't know if everyone on the list that signed that petition is aware of the risk that has, or if there is a risk, or if they care about it. But that's
the risk is only there if you
I don't think we need to go into that.
Not.
We're past time to rehash into it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the stuff so far that's been said on it. I think there has been some discussion on it, but there definitely needs to be more. And I think that just to summarize where we're at for those tuning in, we're not where we started on at the beginning of this call, I don't believe. I think that there is agreement that ProgPoW is not going in anytime soon, and by that definition, in my opinion, that means within the next 3 to 6 months. I do think that...
I heard no such agreement.
No, I said I think there's... Wait, did I say agreement?
Right. I missed. Maybe I didn't hear you.
Oh, maybe I did say agreement. Sorry, what I meant was
it's accepted. It's on track.
It's accepted. It's on track, but it's not. But have we decided on a hard fork that's going in, Greg? That's what I meant.
We've made no
absolutely
decision.
Not going in. No. It is not going into a hard fork anytime soon. Not after this call.
We have not decided which hard fork.
Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't.
No. It is this. It's not going in the schedule anytime soon. I will also say that. Like it being accepted in schedule is very different. And
we have a never mind.
Okay. So yeah, although it is an accepted state, there are some ideas to make it kind of a pocket veto type thing. There are some other ideas to not pursue it right this second, and it sounded like from the pro-ProgPoW side, which obviously doesn't represent everybody, that they were okay with improving and further looking into something that isn't like specifically ProgPoW as it is today. So actually, you know what? This is going over time, but as far as the core devs go, is that where do you think we've come to? Do you think we've come to anything? Martin, especially, Vitalik, Peter, Felix, Thomas.
So I think basically we've come to the conclusion that the community really, really, really doesn't want it. And for me personally, this is a very strong sign. Regardless of, so there is a technical argument to be made for ProgPoW. There is a social argument to be made against ProgPoW. It's if we cannot reach consensus on all sides about what the change should be, it cannot go in. It's just a fact. I think. Like I am not willing to put in the change with so much community resistance, regardless of like where that resistance comes from.
And that is outside of the process technically, but
yes,
yeah.
It might be, like process be process, but with this much pushback, I think it's more important to listen to the pushback and to, follow the process religiously.
Yeah, but it sounds like Christy and BBT have said, actually this is summarized well in the group chat, except the existing EIP 1057 ProgPow gets deprecated for adjustments of the kick fix, plus adjustments included in 0.9.4. This transitions to ETH 2.0 as a new EIP that is yet to be written and then can be superseded. That has been suggested. Do we have any core devs that are saying that's a good idea? Because I was kind of getting that impression earlier, but I don't want to be speaking out of term or saying, it is when it isn't.
I'm not the authority on these kinds of things.
Yeah, you actually are.
It sounds
You're one of them.
Well, like I wouldn't put it this way. So, but what I would say is that it is. It sounds to me like a good idea to rethink it, at least after the revelations with like these two attacks. They definitely have to be addressed on a technical level before we can move forward with any new algorithm, right? It's just like that. These things have to be taken care of anyway. So if that new EIP is going to be called ETH2, and maybe it sounds better. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's not entirely the point of it just sounding better, but I would say I think the core developers need to speak up more personally, because otherwise this is going to get rehashed, and you all are the ones who are deciding if this goes in on a technical level.
Wait, yeah, okay. So from a technical point of view, I think we have implementations of this. There has been a test net. A lot of the research has been done. ProgPow is not it's not actually causing anyone to do any sort of like technical work in the Ethereum clients right now. All the work is basically, I think, on Christie's and IfDefElse's side. So they are more or less actively working on it, but I think the client developers are not spending any time right now implementing anything related to ProgPow. So I don't want anyone to get away with the impression that we are, like prioritizing work on ProgPow over like anything else. We are not.
Okay, any other comments?
So maybe I'll give the summary from Nethermind so it's quite clear which, or at least I'm standing. So one question that comes from the ProgPow proposers is not about the ProgPow itself, but about the notion of ASIC resistance. In general, I'm in favor of ASIC resistance. As for ProgPow, definitely we want to deprecate the EAP that was not addressing the recently discovered issues with ProgPow, and we should replace it with the properly fixed version and then wait for the next series of reviews. And also, I would encourage anybody who wants to push ProgPow to just spawn the fork or new testnet based on ProgPow so people can actually play with it. With the existing client implementations, which I believe are Go, Ethereum, and Parity. Nethermind does not have at the moment support for ProgPow. However, I believe that the ProgPow support in Nethermind can be added without much effort on a short notice in case the decision is made. The fact that we do not have the ProgPow support does not come from for the reason that we do not support it, just because we believe that technically it's not a big effort, but we've seen so far that it was unlikely for the ProgPow to be implemented in a very short time frame. So we were not prioritizing it. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone from Geth want to comment before we go? Or Open Ethereum, actually? That would also be a...
Yeah, I mean, from Open Ethereum, I guess I would comment, we would try to develop for the needs of the Ethereum community. From where we sit, the needs of the Ethereum community are not ProgPow, but other things. So we would develop other things.
Okay, Geth? If you all don't have one, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what. Yeah, I kind of. Yeah, I don't think I can pick a size at this point. Honestly, if the community really doesn't want to do this, then as Felix said, we don't really want to shove it down anyone's throat. However, I kind of do stand on the point that if we figure as core devs, tech leads, whatever, that ProgPow may be useful in the future, then I still think we should pursue just getting the implementations done properly. So either we should say that ProgPow is dead, we don't care, welcome ASICs, go for it. In that case, we can drop ProgPow and be done with it. But then let's accept and let's publicly say that, yes, we know ASICs will become and we don't mind, and the more the better. Or if we say that we don't want ASICs long term, and if ASICs cause any issues, then we should definitely step up against them. Then I do think that we should at least take the code seriously and make sure that it works, so that if there's a need, then there's a way to actually do something meaningful. So that's kind of my personal opinion on this. But I don't want to speak in the name of the team, because I know that Martin, he might have a bit different opinion.
So I think that the decision to like whether or not ASIC resistance is important for Ethereum, this is a purely social decision, and it's something that can be well, it's not. Okay, I know some people will disagree, but it's definitely there are lots of social factors in that decision. So it would definitely help to have more opinions on ASIC resistance from everyone, and that includes the much wider community.
Okay. Anyone else have final stuff before we go?
I'd like to just make oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ben. Let's do Ben first.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, appreciate that. Thank you. I just wanted to make one quick comment on I think for the last number of minutes here on this call, or at least at some point during the call, we were kind of falling back into the trap of trying to convince each other, and either two sides trying to convince the other side. And I just feel as if we're past that point, and no one is likely, there are some portion on each side of the debate that is very unlikely to be convinced by any just argument, barring some kind of new information or change to the state of the network. And so I really think that to move forward as a community, we just have to accept that, even if it may be frustrating on some sides, accept that there are two sides that are unlikely to be convinced without some dramatic new information, and then consider paths forward that make sense given that. Leave that as the baseline. And I say that not just with regards to ProgPow specifically, but with to what's just been being discussed over the last few minutes, which is that we have this kind of I don't know what the right word is, maybe a philosophical issue about whether or not we want ASICs on the network. And I think part of the reason, as I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why there is no clear, why there are two sides on this issue is because there aren't clear answers to this. I mean, the whole space is only 10 years old. We've only seen a few major networks evolve, like Bitcoin, that have become completely ASIC dominated. We don't really know what the long-term game theory is, and it's completely changed by a bunch of specific details with regards to Ethereum, the DAG, the transition to ETH 2.0. So we're not going to solve that problem. We're never going to come to a consensus on that unless, again, there's dramatic new information. And I think we just need to take that as a given and move forward, knowing that we're not going to convince each other on that point.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and this kind of echoes what you just said, Ben. Like, I agree that there's like some fundamental kind of philosophical differences. It's probably kind of pointless to try and resolve them. And I think maybe one like concrete thing that can be done to kind of signal that like there is a move forward is if there is like a new proposal, like I would really kind of favor having that be like a separate EAP. Just and like it might sound like superficial, but I think having like a separate EAP that's kind of started to do some of this, that has like a potentially different name. I don't have a strong opinion on there, but like, yeah, it seems like we discussed a lot of like really interesting changes, and that seemed to have some buy-in from a lot of people during the call, and I don't think adding those on top of the current ProgPow proposal like socially makes a lot of sense.
Okay, let's wrap it up. It's already over. Gonna apologize for the time going over, and also for earlier when I was trying to do a recap of everything. I don't think that's my role. I don't think I need to say what's been decided or what hasn't been decided necessarily every call. I think everyone's heard everything today and can come up with their own conclusions, just like the ETH community should do with this rough consensus model. I should just be here for process primarily and for organization of the calls. So yeah, great talk, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, it's been super important, I feel like, and I think there will come fruitfulness from this. Things will be fruitful from here on out, hopefully, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Hudson.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.